somewhere beneath the surface of a European lake, or buried in the shaft of an abandoned mine, or sealed inside a tunnel that has not been opened since the spring of 1945, series gold, not a legend of gold, not a rumor of gold, actual gold, in quantities that were documented, loaded, transported, and deliberately hidden by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who died, in many cases, before they could tell anyone where they had done it. The question is not whether Nazi Germany accumulated vast quantities of looted wealth during the Second World War. That is documented beyond any serious dispute. The question is not whether significant portions of that wealth were hidden in the final months of the war as the regime collapsed. That is also documented. The question is how much remains hidden, where it is, and whether the institutions and the governments that have the most incentive to find it also have reasons, in some cases, to prefer that it stays lost. Those questions have driven treasure hunters, historians, government investigators, and the intelligence agencies for 8 decades. They have produced genuine discoveries, spectacular frauds, political controversies, and at least one documented case of a government suppressing evidence of what its investigators found because the implications of the discovery were too inconvenient to acknowledge publicly. This is the story of Nazi gold, not the simplified version, the real one. To understand the scale of what Nazi Germany accumulated, you have to understand the mechanism by which it was accumulated, and that mechanism operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The first and the most straightforward level was the systematic looting of the central bank gold reserves of every country Germany occupied. When German forces occupied a country, one of the first priorities of the financial administration that followed the military was the seizure of the national bank's gold reserves. This was not incidental. It was policy, planned in advance, carried out by specialists, and integrated into the broader economic exploitation of occupied territory. The numbers are staggering. Czechoslovakia's gold reserves, approximately $45 million worth at 1939 prices, were seized in 1939 after the occupation of the Rum Czech state. Belgium's gold, approximately $220 million, was seized in 1940 after the fall of Brussels, though its recovery after the war through complex negotiations involving the Bank for International Settlements and the multiple allied governments is one of the more interesting financial detective stories of the post-war period. The Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, Yugoslavia, Greece, all of them lost their central bank gold to the German financial apparatus in the years of German expansion. The mechanism for managing this accumulated wealth was the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, under the presidency of Walter Funk, who had replaced Hjalmar Schacht 1939 and who was subsequently convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and the crimes against humanity. The Reichsbank was the institutional home of the looted central bank gold and the broader accumulated wealth of the Reich, and its vaults and the records are the starting point for understanding where the wealth went as the war turned against Germany. But the central bank gold, large as it was only the most straightforward component of the accumulated wealth. The second component was the systematic looting of privately held wealth from the Jewish populations of occupied Europe and from other groups targeted by the regime. This looting operated at multiple scales, from the legalized robbery of the Nuremberg laws that stripped German Jews of their property through the 1930s, to the industrial-scale theft from Jews and the others transported to the concentration camp system, to the individual-level theft by occupation forces, SS personnel, and the local collaborators across the entire occupied territory. The concentration camp component of the theft is documented in testimony and in the records that survived the war's end. Prisoners arriving at the camps were systematically stripped of everything they possessed. Currency, jewelry, wedding rings, watches, gold, dental work, extracted either before or after death. The gold and the precious metals recovered in this way were processed through the SS financial system, melted down, assayed, and deposited in the Reichsbank under account designations that obscured their origin. The Melmer account, named after SS Habsturmführer Bruno Melmer, who made the regular deposits, received over 76 shipments of looted valuables between 1942 and 1945. The contents including gold bars, foreign currency, jewelry, and the dental gold. The dental gold component is the detail that historians and the researchers have found hardest to write about dispassionately, because it represents the reduction of human beings to their component materials with a thoroughness that is difficult to comprehend as a deliberate institutional policy. The SS maintained careful records of the dental gold deposits. The Reichsbank received them as standard deposits. The system processed human beings as raw material sources with the same bureaucratic precision it applied to every other aspect of the regime's operations. The third component of the accumulated wealth was the looting of cultural property, artworks, manuscripts, religious objects, library collections, and the museum holdings from occupied territory and from Jewish private collections across Europe. The scale of this looting was enormous. The Einsatzstabreichsleiter Rosenberg, the task force established specifically to identify, catalog, and seize cultural property, operated across all the occupied territory with a systematic thoroughness that reflected the regime's genuine ideological investment in the ownership of European cultural heritage. Göring ran a parallel personal looting operation for his private collection at Hall. Hitler's own plans for the F. Museum in Linz drove a specific acquisition program that targeted particular categories of artwork for collection. The cultural property component of the accumulated wealth is relevant to the broader story of Nazi gold for a specific reason. Much of it was never recovered. The Monuments, Fine Arts and the Archives program, the Allied unit tasked with protecting and recovering cultural property, made significant recoveries in the final months of the war and in the years immediately after. Salt mines in Austria, particularly at Old-Aussee, yielded extraordinary quantities of stolen artwork, but the total inventory of what was taken has never been fully reconciled with the total inventory of what was recovered. The gap between those two inventories is, by any reasonable estimate, very large. By 1944, with Allied forces advancing from the west and the Soviet forces pushing steadily from the east, the senior figures of the Nazi regime began to confront a reality that many of them had been refusing to acknowledge for months. The war was lost. The only questions were how long it would take and what could be salvaged from the wreckage. The response to this reality operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the institutional level, the Reichsbank began a program of evacuating its gold and the currency reserves from Berlin to locations in the German interior that were assessed as safer from Allied bombing and less immediately threatened by the advancing Soviet forces. At the personal level, senior SS and the party figures began the process of securing their own futures, converting whatever wealth they could access into portable, concealable, internationally negotiable forms. And at the operational level, specific planned programs of asset dispersal were initiated that were designed to ensure the survival of sufficient wealth to fund the post-war activities of whatever remained of the movement after Germany's military defeat. The most documented of the institutional evacuations was the movement of the Reichsbank's gold reserves from Berlin to a potassium mine at Merkers in Thuringia in early 1945. This transfer moved what remained of the Reichsbank's gold after the preceding years of expenditure, approximately $250 million was at 1945 prices, along with large quantities of foreign currency and the other valuables, into the mine's depths for concealment. The Mercer's cache was discovered by American forces in April tahun 1945 in circumstances that have become one of the more famous treasure discovery stories of the war. A routine military patrol stopped two German women for violating a curfew, and in the course of the conversation that followed, one of them mentioned that the local mine contained the Reichsbank's gold. The Americans investigated. They found it. Eisenhower came to see it personally. It was documented, extracted, and eventually incorporated into the post-war gold restitution process. But the Mercer's cache, large as it was not all of the Reichsbank's reserves. Other transfers had preceded it. Other caches had been created in other locations. And the records of where all of them went were not complete, partly because the record-keeping became increasingly chaotic as the regime disintegrated, and partly because some of the people responsible for the transfers had specific reasons for keeping the locations known only to themselves. The Alpine Redoubt was a concept that shaped the late strategic planning in the final months of the war to a degree that historians have sometimes found embarrassing in retrospect. The idea, which allied intelligence took very seriously in early 1945, was that the Nazi regime was preparing a final defensive stronghold in the Austrian and the Bavarian Alps, a mountain fortress from which a hardcore of SS troops and the senior Nazi officials would mount a prolonged resistance and from which the movement might eventually reconstitute itself. The Alpine Redoubt turned out to be more myth than reality, at least in its military dimensions. The organized mountain fortress never materialized. The SS resistance from the Alps never occurred. But the financial component of the Alpine Redoubt planning was real. Assets were moved south. Gold and the currency were transferred to locations in Bavaria and Austria. And the specific area around the Salzkammergut Lake district in Austria, with its complex geology of deep lakes, abandoned salt mines, and the tunnel systems, became the destination for quantities of wells that have not been fully accounted for in any subsequent investigation. Lake Toplitz in the Austrian Alps is the most famous of the specific locations associated with Nazi wells concealment, partly because of the Operation Bernhard counterfeit currency that was dumped there and which has been periodically recovered by divers since the war, and partly because the lake's exceptional depth, over 100 meters in its deepest section, and the presence of a deep layer of waterlogged logs that effectively blocks access below a certain depth, has made comprehensive search impossible with available technology. The Austrian government has conducted periodic official searches of the lake. Private salvage operations have been attempted. The results have been partial and the lake's full contents remain unknown. But Lake Toplitz was one location among many. Lake Chim in Bavaria, Lake Fuschl in Austria, the Grandelsee, the Horstersee, multiple lakes in the Salzkammergut region received materials in the final weeks of the war, dropped from boats or thrown from shores by SS personnel, who were simultaneously planning their own escapes and trying to conceal the evidence of what they were disposing of. The tunnel systems of the Austrian and the Bavarian Alps received significant quantities of material as well. The salt mines that had already been used as art storage facilities during the bombing campaigns became repositories for other valuables. Abandoned railway tunnels, cave systems. The geological complexity of the Alpine region provided concealment possibilities that our regime in its final chaos could use without the time or resources for more sophisticated arrangements. The specific case of the Reichsbank that left Berlin in the final months of the war and has never been accounted for involves a series of transfers that can be partially traced through surviving documents and the testimony but whose final destinations remain unknown or disputed. One of the most significant involves a shipment of gold and the foreign currency transported by truck convoy from Berlin in January 1945, documented in partial Reichsbank records, that appears to have reached Bavaria but whose subsequent disposition is not recorded in any document that has been made publicly available. The SS had its own separate financial apparatus, distinct from the Reichsbank, that managed the wealth that flowed through the concentration camp system and through the broader economic activities of the SS empire of forced labor and the industrial production. This apparatus, managed through the SS Economics and the Administrative Mine Office under Oswald Pohl, who was tried and executed at Nuremberg, handled quantities of wealth that were not fully integrated into the Reichsbank system and whose ultimate disposition is even less documented than the central bank's records. The Odessa network, about which more has been claimed than can be fully documented, was supposedly the organizational infrastructure that managed the post-war escape and the resettlement of senior SS personnel. Whether Odessa existed as a formal organization or was a looser network of connections and the mutual assistance is debated by historians. What is not debated is that significant quantities of wealth were moved through escape networks to South America, Spain, and the other destinations in the late 1940s, and that this wealth funded the new lives and the ongoing activities of people who had been at the center of the regime's worst crimes. The figure of Otto Skorzeny appears repeatedly in the documented accounts of post-war Nazi financial activity. Skorzeny, the SS officer responsible for the rescue of Mussolini and the numerous other special operations, was one of the most capable and well-connected figures in the post-war SS diaspora. He settled in Spain under Franco's protection, operated what appeared to be a legitimate business consulting firm, and was connected to networks that assisted former SS personnel in multiple ways. The extent to which he was involved in managing concealed Nazi wealth in the post-war period has never been fully established from the publicly available evidence, but his name appears in enough independent accounts that researchers have consistently identified him as a significant figure in whatever organizational structure managed the post-war assets. Argentina under Juan Perón was the primary destination for senior Nazi war criminals who escaped to the Ratlines, and it was also the destination for significant quantities of wealth. The relationship between the Perón government and the Nazi escape network was documented in Argentine government archives that became partially available to researchers in the 1990s. And the picture that emerged was of a government that actively facilitated both the immigration of Nazi war criminals and the movement of associated wealth into Argentine financial institutions. The full extent of what was transferred to Argentina in the late 1940s has not been established from available documents. The Swiss banking system's role in the management of Nazi wealth is one of the most politically sensitive and the most thoroughly investigated aspects of the broader story. Swiss banks accepted deposits from Nazi Germany throughout the war, provided financial services that facilitated German economic activities, and in the post-war period maintained accounts that had been opened by people who were subsequently killed in the Holocaust, accounts whose existence they denied for decades to the survivors and those who attempted to recover them. The investigations conducted in the late 1990s, most notably the Volcker Committee investigation that examined Swiss bank dormant accounts and the Bergier Commission that examined Switzerland's broader wartime economic relationship with Nazi Germany, produced the most comprehensive publicly available accounting of the Swiss dimension of the Nazi Wales story. The Volcker Committee identified approximately 26,000 dormant accounts with probable Nazi-era links. The Swiss banks agreed to a settlement of $1.25 billion with Holocaust survivors and the heirs. The investigations were significant, the settlements substantial, and yet both committees explicitly acknowledged that their work was incomplete, and that the full picture of what passed through Swiss financial institutions during and after the war had not been established. The post-war gold restitution process, managed by the Tripartite Gold Commission established by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, operated for over 50 years before concluding its work in 1998. The Commission managed the distribution of recovered Nazi gold among the countries whose reserves had been seized, distributing approximately $337 million worth of gold to claimant nations. But the Commission itself acknowledged that the gold it distributed represented only a portion of the total that had been looted. The gap between what was looted and what was recovered and redistributed is, by the Commission's own accounting, substantial. The specific mystery of the gold train in Hungary is one of the most thoroughly documented and the most disturbing episodes in the entire story, because it involves not German concealment of Nazi Wales, but American concealment of what happened to Nazi Wales that the United States military captured. The Hungarian gold train was a convoy of 52 railway wagons that left Budapest in November tahun 1944 carrying the portable wealth of Hungary's Jewish community. Property that had been seized by the Hungarian government in compliance with the racial laws that the Quisling Arrow Cross government had implemented. The train carried gold, jewelry, artworks, currency, silver, carpets, and the other valuables that had been systematically stripped from approximately 800,000 Hungarian Jews. American forces captured the train in Austria in May 1945. What happened next was documented in U.S. Army records that remained classified for decades and that became the subject of a lawsuit filed by Hungarian Holocaust survivors in 2001. The survivors alleged, on the basis of declassified documents, that American military personnel systematically looted the train's contents for personal use, that commanding officers used seized Hungarian artworks and the silver to furnish their quarters, that objects were distributed as gifts and the souvenirs, and that the formal accounting of the train's contents was manipulated to conceal the scale of what had been taken. The U.S. government settled the lawsuit for $25.5 million in 2005 without admitting liability, and without providing the full accounting of the train's contents that the survivors had sought. The Hungarian gold train episode is the clearest documented example of a pattern that historians have identified at multiple points in the post-war accounting. That the chaos and the temptation of the final weeks of the war and the immediate post-war period produced theft and concealment not only by the Nazi perpetrators trying to secure their futures but by the Allied forces responsible for recovering and protecting the seized assets. The question of what remains hidden, 80 years after the war's end, is not one that can be answered with confidence from the available evidence. The institutional recoveries of the post-war decades, the Merkers cash, the Altausi artworks, the Swiss bank settlements, the Tripartite Gold Commission distributions, the Hungarian gold train settlement, have together recovered and redistributed significant quantities of what was looted. But the gap between the documented looting and the documented recovery has never been closed. The specific searches that have continued in the decades since the war have produced occasional genuine discoveries and even more false alarms. Polish investigators have spent years investigating reports of a gold-laden Nazi train sealed in a tunnel in Lower Silesia, the same region as the Project Reese tunnel complex. A 2015 announcement by two treasure hunters claiming to have identified a train using ground-penetrating radar attracted international media attention in the formal Polish government investigation that found no more evidence of a train at the reported location. The investigation was thorough and its negative conclusion was reported significantly less widely than the original announcement. The Bavarian lakes continue to attract divers and researchers. The Austrian tunnel systems continue to be investigated. Documents in Russian archives, some of which have been partially released and some of which remain classified, are believed by researchers to contain information about Soviet recoveries in the final weeks of the war that were never disclosed to the Allied accounting bodies. The Soviet forces that overran the eastern portions of the Reich in the spring of 1945 recovered quantities of wells that were incorporated into the Soviet state without documentation that has been made available to outside investigators. The Russian state archives on this subject remain the most significant untapped documentary resource in the entire field. Soviet forces were in Berlin before the Western Allies. They had access to Reichsbank records and the personnel. They conducted their own investigations of the financial aspects of the Nazi regime. What they found, and what they took, and what their records show about the disposition of assets in the areas they controlled, is not publicly known. The most honest answer to the question of how much Nazi gold remains hidden is that no one knows. And that the institutional and the political barriers to a full accounting have not been fully dismantled 80 years after the war ended. The banks that may hold dormant accounts have financial interests in not identifying them. The governments that may have classified records of their own forces' behavior during and after the war have political interests in maintaining those classifications. The states that received assets through various channels in the post-war period have diplomatic interests in not drawing attention to those transfers. The wealth that was accumulated by a regime through theft from nations and from individuals, including theft from people they were simultaneously killing, does not disappear simply because the regime that accumulated it has been defeated and its leaders tried and in many cases executed. The wealth exists. Its location, in whole or in part, is unknown. And the people with the best information about where it is are, 80 years later, mostly dead. What the Nazi gold story ultimately reveals is not primarily a mystery of location, though the location mystery is real. It reveals something about the relationship between wealth and the atrocity, about the ways in which the financial dimensions of historical crimes outlast the political and the military dimensions by generations, and about the specific difficulty of achieving genuine accountability for crimes whose perpetrators were careful to ensure that the financial traces were as thoroughly obscured as the human ones. The gold is somewhere. The jewelry is somewhere. The artworks are somewhere. The accounts exist somewhere in financial systems that have never been fully transparent about what they hold and on whose behalf they hold it. The people it was stolen from are, in most cases, gone. The children are aging. The grandchildren are fighting legal and diplomatic battles in institutions that were not designed to provide the kind of accountability that 8 decades of accumulated injustice would actually require. The mines are still sealed. The lakes are still deep. The archives are still partially closed. And somewhere in the silence between what was documented and what was recovered, the accounting that was never completed continues to wait. It has been waiting for 80 years. And in the specific patience of wealth that does not age, does not decay, and does not forget what it is and where it came from, it may wait for 80 more. The treasure was never just gold. It was the evidence of what human beings are willing to do to other human beings when power removes every constraint on their behavior. And the fact that significant portions of it have never been found is not a mystery. It is a verdict on how seriously the world has pursued the accounting that the victims deserved and the justice requires. The lakes are cold, the tunnels are dark, and the silence where the answers should be is the loudest thing in this entire story.